Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into a war you've probably never heard about, but should have. The 100-hour war between El Salvador and Honduras. Sounds short, right? But what if I told you it wasn't just about borders, or even soccer, like the headlines claimed? It was about land, about power, about desperation and denial. And like most conflicts, the spark came last, after years of quiet, growing pressure. Let's set the scene. First off, picture two countries side by side, Honduras and El Salvador. Now imagine that one of them, El Salvador, is bursting at the seams with people. It's densely populated, and there just isn't enough land to go around. Meanwhile, right next door, Honduras has plenty of land, but a much smaller population. You don't have to be a geographer to see where this is going. These demographic and geographic differences laid the groundwork for tension, and over time, thousands of Salvadorans began migrating into Honduras, hoping to find space, opportunity, and farmland. But this wasn't some smooth integration story. Nope. The arrival of Salvadorans triggered resentment among Hondurans, who saw them as outsiders, competition for land, jobs, and even culture. And here's where things start to tighten. Both of these countries, in the 1960s, were ruled by centralized military regimes, not exactly known for their openness or flexibility. These regimes weren't just powerful, they were fragile, and they relied heavily on populist messaging to keep the public in check. What better way to unify a frustrated nation than to find a convenient villain? Migrants, or better yet, another country. So beneath the surface, long before a single shot was fired, the seeds of conflict were already taking root, fueled by overcrowding, nationalism, and top-down rule that prioritized control over compassion. Stick around, because on the next slide, we'll explore how land reform, on paper, a solution, ended up making everything worse. So, you might be wondering, if land was the problem, why didn't anyone fix it? Well, they tried. Sort of. But what unfolded was a masterclass in how centralized power and corruption can take a good idea and rot it from the inside out. Let's talk about Honduras. On paper, they had plans for agrarian reform, land redistribution. A noble idea, right? Take underused land from massive estates and give it to the people who need it most, landless farmers, many of them Salvadoran migrants. But here's the thing, when land reform is controlled by the very elites who own the land, guess what happens? They stall. They rewrite the rules. They make sure that reforms never really touches their wealth. That's exactly what happened here. Honduras elite landowners delayed and distorted the process so effectively that inequality didn't shrink, it deepened. And it wasn't just about the land. The entire political system was built on favors. Need a job? Better have a political ally. Need access to credit or infrastructure? Get in line, right behind the president's cousin. Policy didn't serve the people. It served the powerful, and the powerful weren't interested in resolving the land issue. Instead, they leaned on something far easier: blame. That's where the migrants came in. Thousands of Salvadorans, many of them poor and desperate, became easy scapegoats. They were portrayed as invaders, taking what belonged to Hondurans. Suddenly, land inequality wasn't a result of corruption or policy failure, it was the fault of foreigners. Problem solved, right? Except, not at all. This kind of scapegoating didn't just distract from the root causes, it inflamed them. It turned neighbors into enemies and painted structural failure as a national security threat. When leaders fear reform more than they fear conflict, tension builds. And when elites wrap their failures in the flag, war becomes easier than change. Next, we'll look at how a soccer match, yes, a soccer match, lit the fuse. Alright, now this is where things get surreal. You've got migration tension, land inequality, centralized corruption, all simmering quietly. Then, out of nowhere, soccer. But this wasn't just any soccer match. This was a 1970 World Cup qualifier between El Salvador and Honduras. And in that moment, the football pitch became a battlefield of its own. Sport, as it turns out, can be more than just a game. It can become a theater for identity, resentment, and revenge. In these matches, national pride wasn't just on the line, it was weaponized. Fans weren't just cheering for goals. They were projecting their frustrations, their fears, and their anger onto the other side. Every foul, every missed call, every anthem sung, it all became political. And right behind the roar of the stadium, the media. In both countries, the press wasn't exactly independent. State-controlled outlets pushed sensationalist narratives, inflaming tensions even further. Every incident on or off the field was spun into evidence of national victimhood. They attacked our players. They disrespected our anthem. They insulted our people. Headlines screamed. Radios blared. And the people, already on edge, started to believe that this wasn't about soccer anymore. This was about survival, about dignity, about revenge. But perhaps the most dangerous move of all came from the elites. Facing economic instability and mounting unrest, the ruling regimes in both countries saw the perfect opportunity: use the soccer conflict to distract from domestic failures, stir up nationalism, rally the people, shift the blame. And it worked. For a while, the line between the stadium and the battlefield blurred. The spark had been struck, and what came next was swift, brutal, and anything but symbolic. Coming up next, the war itself, what happened when the game turned into gunfire. And then, it happened. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador invaded Honduras. No more games, no more rhetoric. It was a full-scale military assault. Now, let's pause for a second. This wasn't some epic, drawn-out war. It lasted about 100 hours. But don't let the length fool you. This thing hit hard and fast. Airstrikes, ground troops, border clashes. For 4 straight days, chaos reigned. The official justification? Protect Salvadoran citizens who were being attacked and expelled from Honduras. But underneath that, decades of pressure exploding all at once: land, migration, political failure, and nationalist rage colliding in real time. The Organization of American States scrambled to respond. Within 100 hours, they brokered a ceasefire. That sounds like a win, right? Not really. The core issues, the overcrowding, the broken land system, the scapegoating, the political corruption, none of it was solved. The guns went quiet, but the problems didn't. And then there's the cost. About 6,000 people lost their lives. Thousands more were displaced, families torn apart, homes destroyed. Infrastructure was shattered in both countries. And for what? A war with no resolution, no meaningful gain, and no accountability. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a violent symptom of deeper dysfunction. And as we'll see next, the damage didn't end when the soldiers pulled back. The true cost of this conflict kept unfolding, economically, socially, and regionally. So, the bullets stopped flying. But here's the thing about war, especially wars rooted in unresolved structural problems: the damage doesn't just stop with a ceasefire. In fact, the real casualty of the 100-hour war wasn't just the soldiers or civilians who died. It was the economy, and not just in El Salvador and Honduras, but across the entire region. Let's start with Central American economic integration. Before the war, there was momentum. Countries in the region were trying to build a shared market, encourage trade, develop common infrastructure, kind of like an early version of the European Union, but on a smaller scale. But after the war, that dream shattered. The trust was gone. Borders hardened. Tariffs returned. Diplomacy froze. Central America had a chance to build together, and it slipped through their fingers. Meanwhile, inside both countries, things got even worse. Migration exploded. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had been living and working in Honduras. After the war, many were kicked out or fled, creating massive displacement and overwhelming El Salvador's already strained economy. Trade routes between the two countries collapsed. Goods that used to flow freely now faced roadblocks, suspicion, and violence. Cross-border business? Gone. Investment? Scared away. Opportunities? Vanished. And here's something crucial. Instead of investing in rebuilding, both governments doubled down on militarization. Defense budgets soared while public services were starved. Roads crumbled. Schools deteriorated. Healthcare? A distant priority. This wasn't just economic mismanagement, it was a shift in values, a redirection of national resources away from long-term growth and toward short-term control. The result? Long-standing stagnation and rising inequality. The very problems that caused the conflict in the first place got worse, and now they were harder to fix. Next, we'll zoom out and look at the bigger picture. How this war became a textbook example of unintended consequences, and why top-down systems often fail when they can't adapt. Let's take a step back. By now, we've seen how a short war caused long-lasting damage. But here's where things get even more revealing. Because the 100-hour war wasn't just a failure of diplomacy, it was a failure of systems. At the center of it all was centralized governance, military regimes that operated more like pressure cookers than problem solvers. These were governments that didn't listen to the people, they managed them. And when tensions rose, instead of adapting, they doubled down. That's the thing about top-down power structures: when they fail, they tend to fail dramatically. There were so many moments where flexible, local solutions might have worked. Land reform could have been fair. Migration policy could have been humane. Economic cooperation could have been deepened. But none of that happened because centralized control tends to favor appearance over substance. So what did they do instead? They reached for nationalism, for distraction. They pointed to enemies abroad instead of problems at home. And in doing so, they created a fragile kind of unity, one built on fear, blame, and pride, not trust or progress. The war became a mirror, a brutal, 4-day reflection of decades of mismanagement. It revealed what happens when leadership confuses control with competence, when public frustration is ignored until it erupts. And maybe the most haunting part? Once the war was over, the same system stayed in place. No reforms, no reckoning, just more of the same, until the next crisis. But we're not done yet, because in the final slide, we'll ask the most important question of all: what does this forgotten conflict teach us today? So, what do we take from all this? A war sparked by soccer, rooted in land disputes, driven by fear, and fueled by failure. Sounds absurd, right? But the truth is, it's disturbingly familiar. The 100-hour war shows us what happens when symbolic conflicts are allowed to take the place of real solutions. When governments use drama to distract from dysfunction. When leaders stoke emotion instead of addressing the facts on the ground. It's a story of systems that preferred control over creativity, uniformity over flexibility. And those systems didn't just collapse, they calcified. The damage wasn't explosive, it was corrosive. The war ended, but the people didn't get their land. The migrants didn't get justice. The economies didn't recover, and no one in power faced the consequences. And maybe that's the most chilling part. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Because today, in many places, we still see the same patterns. Overcrowding, economic fragility, scapegoating, rulers choosing spectacle over substance, propaganda over policy, and nations turning inward when cooperation could save them. So ask yourself, when we see tension rising in the world today, what's really underneath it? Who's being blamed? Who's benefiting? And who's being forgotten? History doesn't just repeat. Sometimes, it whispers through stories that no one remembers. And that's why we tell them here. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If this made you think, make sure to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the past that echo into the present. And don't forget, you can listen to the podcast version of this episode by clicking the link in the description. We've got plenty more coming, so if you love history that teaches and challenges you, stick around. Until next time.